There are some pretty high win rates here, 40%, 43%, but I'm going to explain the nuance with these win rates because if you just see the pure number, sometimes it isn't accurate. You need to understand how it performed out of sample, which I'll explain in a second to avoid overfitting bias. You need to understand how many trades it took. Was it executing on high frequency or low frequency? You also need to understand the risk parameters. So if you're taking on 60% drawdowns for a 70% return, sometimes that's less optimal than taking on 20% drawdowns for like a 30% return. Even though you're underperforming, you took on far less risk. So, and you'll know this if you watch my last video of the Garch method, sometimes it's worth accepting returns for better risk-adjusted returns. That's how professional fund managers and quant traders actually view the market. I'll explain what I mean by out of sample because this is very important. And this is what a lot of people get wrong when they're backtesting strategies. If you just take a sample, so let's say you take the last 7 years and you just look at the data linearly, you can fall victim to overfitting bias. What does this mean? Well, if you're running a backtest, you're obviously going to be looking at the strategies which perform the best. But just because something performed really well over the last 10 years doesn't mean it's going to perform well over the next 10 years. Why? Because you're simply looking at the results of that data during that specific time frame. There could be a better strategy, a more optimal strategy for the next 10 years, which performed worse over that period. But because the other strategy which performed better was overfit, more fitting towards the bias of max returns during that time period, then you're going to have skewed data. And it'll be too late. By the time you're actually running that test, you won't know until it actually underperforms over the next 10 years. And then in 10 years' time, it'll be probably a completely new strategy which performs. Which is why today, if you look at the strategy, we actually have an out of sample win rate alongside the overall win rate. So what is out of sample? This is essentially a hidden exam which is not part of the initial test. So Claude has access to the first 70% of data. This is the in-sample data. This is what Claude can basically see and test on. For example, 2017 up until 2024. But then we have a smaller period, which is the out-of-sample period, which we didn't include in the data to actually see how that test performs in the future. This is essentially the equivalent of, let's assume you ran a backtest for the last 5 years from 2021 till 2026, seeing what would happen to that strategy in the future. So you almost have to pretend the present day is 2024 and then use the out of sample period as the following 2 years. Obviously, this is not perfect because obviously the out of sample period is not going to be as data rich. So the sample size isn't as big, but what it's going to do is allow you to compare to see when in sample and out of sample is aligned. Typically, when there's alignment between the in sample results and the out of sample results, that's an indicator that it could be a better strategy. Now, that doesn't mean it's the perfect strategy. You still need to take it, critically examine. There's lots of still discretionary stuff that you need to do to examine. You need to look at the max drawdown. You need to look at the win rate. You need to look at the Sharpe ratio, and then you can work out why the strategy performed. I think a big mistake people make when backtesting and using AI strategies is they'll just look at the data and it'll be like, oh, this is the best strategy because it performed the best. But you have to understand why. When was it taking trades? Why did that strategy perform? Is it because it was a volatile period in the market and it was an RSI strategy? So it did well because RSI was constantly oscillating. Is it because it was a breakout strategy and it was a long continuation market? So the market was in aggressive bull market territory. And this is where your discretionary bias towards the market will also inform what AI strategies you select at certain times. Now, obviously, you're not going to get it right all the time, but if you have a bias that, let's say, over the next 2 years, we're going to be in a ranging market on Bitcoin or a ranging market on equities, then the type of strategies that you select will be more biased towards that. Even if they've performed a little bit worse in the past, as long as the data is decent in a similar environment to what you are projecting, then it still could be a good strategy.